Hello everyone, my name is Ігор Соловей. I am the head of the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security at the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy. Mass murders in Bucha and Izyum, missile attacks on the railway station in Kramatorsk and the village of Groza in Kharkiv region, the destroying of Mariupol with the bombing of a maternity hospital and a drama theater, in the basements of which parents and children were hiding. This incomplete list of occupiers' crimes against the civilian population is far from being complete. And all these crimes, are they occasional excesses? Or maybe they are part of the Putin regime's policy of genocide against all Ukrainians. We at the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security were looking for an answer to this question in our study, Genocidal Rhetoric of the Russian Regime, which was presented in 2023. Generally speaking, genocide is the most serious crime in the list of international crimes, and proving it in court is a very difficult task. Therefore, the identification of genocidal rhetoric by government officials is an important step in proving that their actions were intended to commit genocide. After all, international law allows the above-mentioned and other episodes to be qualified both as acts of genocide and as war crimes or crimes against humanity. First of all, it is worth understanding what is meant by the definition of genocidal rhetoric. Its components include calls for genocide. It also includes approving or neutral coverage of crimes against a group, here Ukrainians, which is being subjected to genocide. Also the use of euphemisms, that is, these are mitigating or disguising expressions that are used instead of words that are perceived as undesirable. They are usually used to dehumanize victims and justify crimes against them. The elements of the crime of genocide include not only the murder of members of a particular national, ethnic, or religious group, but also the causing of severe physical or mental harm to its members, the deliberate creation of living conditions aimed at its destruction, and the forced transfer of children to another group. So, to understand whether the Russian regime really intends to commit genocide against Ukrainians, we, at the Center for Strategic Communications, examined Russian legislation, public statements by Russian President Putin and other representatives of his regime, as well as the content of state media and school manuals for genocidal rhetoric. The latter are produced by order and under the control of the government, and therefore reflect its official position. This work revealed that Russian legislation contains a number of regulations aimed at discriminating against both Russian citizens of Ukrainian ethnic origin and Ukrainians living in the occupied territories. The activities of Ukrainian organizations are prohibited in Russia. Any involvement in them is subject to administrative and even criminal liability. The use of the Ukrainian language has been forced out of the public space, and the total Russification of education is ongoing, which is part of the linguistic war. Also, during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian authorities adopted a number of other legislative acts that create a legal framework for committing crimes that constitute genocide. It is about restricting the rights of Ukrainians who have not received a Russian passport, about forced deportations from the occupied territories. The Kremlin regime pays special attention to the deportation of children. It was precisely for the illegal transfer of Ukrainian children from Ukraine that the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin and his Russian official, Maria Lvova-Belova, the children's ombudsman of Russia. All of us around us are also witnessing how Russian propaganda continues to dehumanize and demonize Ukrainians, issuing threats to use nuclear weapons and calling for murder. Genocidal rhetoric is used not only by participants of propaganda talk shows or administrators of anonymous Telegram channels. The non-recognition of Ukrainians as a separate nation with the right to their own national identity and sovereign state is part of the rhetoric of the Russian authorities. For this purpose, Putin and his subordinates engage in pseudo-scientific discussions about the origin of the words Ukraine and Ukrainians. They derive these phrases from the Russian word Ukraina, outskirts, and thus demonstrate the inauthenticity of the Ukrainian language. These statements are supposed to prove that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. The non-recognition of the existence of the Ukrainian people can also be found in official documents, in particular in those acts by which the Kremlin is trying to legally register its illegal attempts to annex the occupied territories. The mythical people of the Kherson region, of the Zaporizhia region, of Crimea, and even the people of the LPR and DPR are mentioned. And representatives of the Russian authorities regularly refer to Ukrainians as Nazis, fascists, sometimes with the prefix neo, nationalists, and Banderites. All of these terms are interchangeable in Russian political discourse and have a strong negative connotation. They are used as euphemisms for dehumanizing Ukrainians and justifying aggression and other crimes. Let me remind you that the former president of Russia and current deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, imitates the rhetoric of Rwandan radio 1000 Hills when he compares Ukrainians to cockroaches and pigs in his Telegram channel and describes Ukraine's international partners as Western pig herds. The pages of state media contain materials that both repeat the aforementioned rhetoric and rationalize the genocide of Ukrainians and contain specific recommendations for its implementation. The most notable example of this is the article, "What Russia Should Do with Ukraine," published on the website of the RIA Novosti State News Agency on 3rd of April 2022. Its author, political strategist Timofey Sergeytsev, insists on the need for the physical elimination of the Ukrainian political class and military, on mass repression, ethnic cleansing, and total de-Ukrainization, which should even include the rejection of the word Ukraine. All the texts by Sergeytsev and his associates actually decipher the term denazification in the sense used by Putin and other representatives of the Russian regime. This means the prohibition of Ukrainian national identity and the physical destruction of its bearers. School history textbooks also contribute to the formation of prejudiced, arrogant, and negative attitudes towards Ukrainians. They are portrayed as people incapable of creating their own state and as carriers of a culture that is at least inferior to the Russian one. For these textbook authors, supporters of independence and the European vector of Ukraine's development are traitors and enemies. And the key theses of state propaganda about the revolution of dignity as a coup d'etat, Ukrainian Nazis, the artificiality of Ukrainian identity, and so on, have been incorporated into high school textbooks. The conspiracy theory that Ukrainians were allegedly invented by the Austrian General Staff to divide the united Russian people has also become part of the textbook content. The authors of these textbooks, just like the Kremlin, deny the artificial and genocidal nature of the Holodomor of 32 to 33 in Ukraine, diminish its scale, and justify its organizers. This can also be considered part of genocidal rhetoric. Thus, the analysis conducted by the Center for Strategic Communications suggests that the sources representing the position of the Russian regime contain elements of genocidal rhetoric, and the policy of the Russian state as a whole is aimed at creating conditions for the crime of genocide against Ukrainians, justifying this crime and encouraging Russian society to support it. The existence of the Ukrainian nation is denied by Russian propaganda at the state level, and the representatives of Ukrainian identity are dehumanized with euphemisms. Russian state media regularly publish articles aimed at justifying and rationalizing the genocide of Ukrainians and the destruction of the Ukrainian state. Russian legislation contains a number of measures that discriminate against Ukrainians and legalize genocidal practices. Therefore, this study by the Center for Strategic Communications, which I have described, will be attached by the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine to the criminal case on the investigation of the crime of genocide. which is currently being carried out by the Russian Federation.
прямо зараз здійснює Російська Федерація.